Laurie Chetwood is the founder of Chetwoods, one of the leading architectural practices delivering major logistics infrastructure. He's also an accomplished artist whose work was exhibited in the Royal Academy Summer Show and in the V&A's Zoomorphic Design exhibition. So Laurie, the increase in online retailing as a result of COVID has brought a lot of focus, hasn't it, onto logistics in London, on consolidation, and also on the use of industrial land. So how do you see this shaping the city over the next few years?
From my point of view, COVID has accelerated the whole idea. Initially, before COVID even, there was a big drive towards online sales, as you know, and in turn that has a major effect on land prices and the pressure on land in the city. So 300,000 homes a year are due to be built. Now the pressure that actually puts on what people want, the stuff they want, has a major impact on space in the city. So what happens? People sort of forgot about that as far as I could see. And what has happened is house prices are one thing, but land prices for logistics to supply the houses has gone through the roof. So prices per acre for logistics space far exceeds retail space. Now it's something like £7 million an acre, something like that, quite amazing. So that in turn makes sure that developers have to pay top dollar for sites, and in turn they have to make sure they're getting as much space and value out of that site as they can. In turn, the people they're building this space for are desperate to get to households who are increasing all the time in cities. It's something like 3/4 of the population are urban dwellers, and they have to make sure that they are serving those customers. So the pressure on land is huge. What have we had to do? We've had to, instead of the usual box on the side of a motorway, which is usually single story and fairly anonymous, people have sort of almost forgotten about them, out of sight, out of mind type of thing. Now a logistics space has got to almost grow up, because we are suggesting and developers are demanding that the space has to go up. It's not just single story stuff, it's 2 or 3 stories. But at the same time, they're in sensitive spots. They're going to be next to residential, they could be next to the DLR. So almost these sites or this sector has had to grow up and make sure that it's behaving itself in a way. So not only, it's quite interesting, we're going up, and that is an issue in itself. We're also having to think laterally about where can you put logistics space in spaces you wouldn't normally expect to find it. So for instance, we're going down as well as up. We're looking at a site, Rectory Farm near Heathrow, which is almost urban but not far off, whereby we're reusing gravel pits that are being extracted. Gravel's being extracted. They've had to put a lid on the top to stop the dust getting into the planes, and then they want to turn that into logistics space. So that's an imagination excellent, and they're putting a park on top of the lid and everything else, a green and pleasant land on top. But at the same time, we're working with a developer who's bought a load of NCP car parks in the city. Now they go up, as you know, but they also go down, and they're looking for different uses, one of which is logistics, so consolidation centres. And it is possible to actually make those spaces work. It's tricky, but it is possible for logistics. Obviously, we're looking at things like dark hotels as well. But so up, down, and then the other thing, which I know I've spoken to you about this before, but the infrastructure that connects these spaces. So we're looking at the rail line, the mail rail that runs under London. So different sorts of ways of connecting, at the same time taking off the road white vans and using a rail system or a system which can take goods from one end of London to the other. So it's a matter of what we call hidden spaces, looking at things slightly differently. But I suppose the meat and drink of the whole thing is trying to convince a local authority or a borough that going up is going to be great for the city because it's going to be supplying the chimney pots, but does it actually behave itself when it does go up? Because they're pretty brutal projects, and they're quite stark. And we used to do, just quickly on this one, we used to do supermarkets. There was one elevation was the entrance, and the other 3, what do you do? And the issue with logistics is there probably aren't any elevator. There's probably a very small entrance opportunity. So you have to use your imagination to sell these things. We were talking to Newham council about one of our sites, Peruvian Wharf, just maybe 6 months ago, and to actually really come up with something that is identifiable and is decent without it just being, it does exactly what it says on the tin, is quite tricky. So quite a demanding thing for designers, and actually funnily for developers. Developers haven't been used to having to behave themselves with these sort of buildings in the past. It's not that they haven't been irresponsible, but it's because they're on sites next to motorways. It's fairly simple and unassuming. Now they've got to start thinking a bit more laterally.
Of course, the pressure on industrial land is something that the Mayor is worried about too. And you're working on warehouses of the future and industrial intensification. How's that going to work?
Yeah, very much so. The SIL land, as they call it, strategic industrial locations, and very important for us. And we're working on several of those. In fact, we've got a sort of undergraduate scheme which we bring bright students in on one of the for research purposes mainly, and they've put together a sort of compendium of all the strategic sites in London and put like a top trumps against each one, saying, oh, well, why is this a good site? Will it actually be useful? Is it near river access? Is it away from green spaces, etc., etc.? So we put that together. But what we're finding is those SIL sites have got great opportunities. They almost help with the way I was mentioning how having to mix things up because of sites next door. SIL land demands that you get a certain amount of space, industrial space, on the site. If you manage to achieve that, you can then do what you like. So on top, next to, blah, blah, blah. So we are involved in quite a big scheme at Morden Wharf with U&I, the property developer. And they have 1,500 high-end residential high-rise flats going next to this protected wharf, Morden Wharf, on the Thames, just before the Blackwall Tunnel. And they're having to get to that site through SIL land. So I think people generally used to think SIL land, that means an industrial estate from the 60s, you know, it's going to be pretty grim, anonymous. It doesn't have to be like that. We've actually had less trouble with the SIL land with Greenwich, who the borough in charge, than the residential. Because actually, if you start mixing things up a little bit with makerspace or SMEs, plus, in this case, logistics, you can actually take what I would call industrial chic element of it all and start turning that to your advantage. It feels right at the moment that people would enjoy a sort of industrial approach to buildings. And if you get the sort of imagery right, it's actually beginning to work. But the point I made about once you get the certain quota of space on top, you can then start putting things on top. Now, I think most people would be reluctant possibly to buy a house on top of a logistics space, for instance. But in this case, we're going from the ground, which is the 1,500 homes more or less, and then sort of stepping up. So the park that surrounds the 1,500 homes sort of goes up onto the top as well. So it's a sort of, it's blurred the edges a bit between the two uses, and I think that begins to make it feel as though it could possibly happen. So that's where we are with the SIL land, a good opportunity. If you know the rules, there are opportunities.
Well, one of the biggest logistical projects is the move of the city markets to Barking and Dagenham. I mean, this will have a huge impact on the borough and on East London. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
I mean, when we were first approached to do that, my initial thought was, what a shame that these markets are not leaving London. They're still in London, but they're not from out of the centre. But the City of London have this remit to make sure everything's done for the benefit of London. And if you have turned up, and we've had a few meetings at Smithfield at 2 o'clock in the morning where you see what's going on there, and it is, you know, it's pushing it to actually get that to work in the way it should. Even if you just look at the logistics, literally, about these huge vehicles coming into the centre and so forth. So the environmental side is quite a big issue, but also the health and safety, some of the working practices. I think the City of London see an opportunity out in Barking to consolidate the three markets into one place, to bring wholesale food up to date, because it's been difficult. Even though the other two markets have sort of moved from their original space, they're still interesting. The new Billingsgate situation was demanded that the old Billingsgate layout was built out in Docklands, and with it came some really interesting but very difficult problems now. So with the way things have developed, we now have a situation where supermarkets would love to be using these markets, and therefore there is an opportunity, for instance, to bring everything up to date, health and safety, hygiene, working practices, to make sure people who work there are looked after. And on top of that, I think the opportunities are great. The city is trying to bring a big educational side into this, about healthy food, food preparation, apprenticeships and so forth. So they're putting quite a lot of that into this particular idea. The fact that we're designing it in such a way that the public can visit these markets and see the process and see what's going on from these three big atria that run down the middle of each site is quite interesting. It is nevertheless a very practical, pragmatic idea at the back of this, is to make things more efficient and so forth, but it will be producing jobs for the area. But I'm hoping we can get as much out of the project as we can for the environmental side. It's a BREEAM excellent idea, but I'm also hoping we can get the public involved and the community involved as much as we can. And I think education is the big one for the City of London on this one.
But you're also doing a number of pretty avant-garde buildings in China, which are more reflective of your work as an artist. How has COVID affected those projects?
I have never heard the word COVID mentioned, and I don't know whether they're blissfully trying to ignore the whole thing, but I think their natural enthusiasm and this drive to get things done and to be the best and beat the city next door, it's just it's great fun if you're a designer. They have every faith still in the Western way, the Western designers, more than even the West does with Western designers, in my opinion. So if you say something, they'll embrace the idea. We've just done a huge station in. We've added to the huge station, and they asked for a new idea because for some reason they couldn't put all the retail they needed to because of fire regs. So we came up with a new idea, which was an indoor garden around the 5 senses. So we made 5 oases, all to do with each of the senses. And they went for that hook, line, and sinker, and we're now doing that. So I think if I did mention that to maybe a developer in the UK, I might have it'd probably been the old ice cube bit where it slowly got melted down into not very much by the end of it. So I've ended up, at least, that's what I like about it. They're more likely to say yes than no. And there isn't a quantity surveyor who's going to start hacking it out, because have to be honest, they have got the money to do it. So, but it's great fun, and I'm really enjoying it.